Daf Pei Ches Amud Beis will begin Pei Ches Amud Aleph, the beginning of the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom. Back to Gemara, my time. What is the reason? The Reish of the Mishnah said that if it's a chaser, which is less than arba amas, you can't pour the wastewater unless there's an ukah, which implies that if there's dalet amas, then an ukah cesspool is not required. So my time, or what is the reason? Because the average amount, the normal amount of wastewater that a person discards, throws out, is daily is 2 sa'im. And therefore, now, the issue over here is that a person, if he throws the water, and if it looks like his intent is that he's throwing it into the Rishus Harabim, now even though he's throwing the water into his chaser and it flows on its own into the Rishus Harabim, but if his intent is that it should flow there, he might pour it directly into the Rishus Harabim, so he might be mitzi. Now, this amount of water in an area which is Daled Amas, or C Daled al Daled, over there we say a person ba'arba amas adam leitzel zalfen. He wants the water. He wants the water in the chatzir. He doesn't want it to flow out because he wants to have the dust settle. The chatzir had earthen floors, and we'll see in the Gemara shortly about the difference between summer and winter. But in the summertime, it's dusty. He wants to use the chatzir. So this amount of water, which is normally what is discarded daily, is used and needed and desired to be in the chatzir to keep the dust down. So he doesn't want it to flow out. So therefore, there's no reason to answer this on account of that he made their pour directly into the Rishus Harabim, because the intent over here is not even to have it flow into the Rishus Harabim. So therefore, in such a case, it's mutter. But if it's less than dalet amas, he doesn't sprinkle it. He pours it out. So therefore, if he pours it into the cesspool, then it's mutter. Then because that can contain the water, and so therefore he has no need to pour it into the Rishus Harabim, and that's not his intent. But if not, if there's no ukah, then it's also. So if he doesn't use the water, and if there's no ukah, he wants the water to run off into the Rishus Harabim. If he wants it to run off in the Rishus Harabim, we're afraid that he might pour it directly into the Rishus Harabim. So that is the first reason that is given. It's because he's mezalef. Rav Zera says a different reason. He says dalet amas timing. He says if the 4 amas, you have that amount of water, the sasayim, it gets absorbed into the ground. So there's no need to make a cesspool because it'll get absorbed into the ground anyway. But if it's less than dalet amas, there's not enough ground area to absorb the water. So therefore, he wants it to flow into the Rishus Harabim. And therefore, if he'll pour it into the Rishus Harabim, he has to make an ukah. My beinaya, what's the difference between the two reasons? Amar Abaye, orach v'koten ik beinaya. The chiluk is if it is square or not square rectangular. If it's a question of the mezalev, that you want this water to be mezalev, so the way the Ritva explains it is as follows: that if it's an area where the chatzir is square, that you use it for different types of uses, and you use it for uses where you want it to be presentable, because it has a functional area. So he might use it for all kinds of purposes where he wants it to look presentable. So therefore, if it's dalet al dalet, if it's square, then there's a reason for mezalef. He wants to keep the earth down, the dust down, so that it's not messy, and he can use it for these types of presentable uses. But if the area is not square, even if it has an area of 16 square amas, but if it's not 4 by 4, let's say it's 8 by 2, he doesn't use it for these types of uses, and therefore he's not makbid on the appearance so much. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't therefore sprinkle. And therefore, in such an area, if he would pour out the water, it would be to run off into the Rishus Harabim, and therefore it would be awesome. So according to Rabbah, in such a case, it would be awesome. But according to Rav Zera, who says it's absorption, if it's a question of absorption, it doesn't matter on the configuration. It's the The issue is the total area. So it doesn't make a difference if it's 4 by 4 or 2 by 8. As long as you have 16 square amas, that amount of earth will absorb the water. So according to Rabbi Zera, therefore, it makes no difference. And as long as you have 16 square amas, you'll be allowed to pour out the water. But according to Rabbah, it would have to be an area which has at least dalet al dalet square. So Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, we learned in the Mishnah that you need a chalzer for dalet amas in order to pour out the water or the waste, but you can combine the area of the chalzer and the achsadra to have the area to combine to make up the total of dalet. Now, we're assuming right now that the achsadra doesn't run along the entire length of the chalzer. There's an achsadra at one portion in one area and one corner of the chalzer. So, Bishlam Rav Zera, according to Rav Zera, that it's not based on the configuration, it's based on the total area. We understand why and how you can combine the two. But according to Rabbah, it's a kasha, it's shver. According to Rabbah, you need a square area. And how can you combine the chalzer with the achsadra? He answers, you could learn that the case is telling that the chalzer runs along the whole face of the chalzer. So therefore, it is square. Meaning, if you have a chalzer which is 3 by 4, and then you have the achsadra which runs along the whole length of the chalzer, so it's 1 by 4, so now you have 4 by 4, and it's square. You can learn that that's a configuration of the achsadra, and therefore what it means in the Mishnah is that you'll end up with an area which is dalet by dalet. Tashma, let's bring a raya from a brisa. Chatzer she'ein bo dalet amas al dalet amas. Now here it says clearly in the brisa that if it doesn't have dalet al dalet, it has to be square. Ein sheifchen l'seicha ma'im Shabbos. You can't pour the water onto it on Shabbos. So you see clearly that you need dalet al dalet. Bishlama l'Rabba nicha. According to Rabbah, it's good. You see that it has to be not only the area but also the configuration. A letter of a zera kasha, but according to Rav Zera, it's a kasha. Amar lach Rav Zera, let's answer, Hamani Rabboni, Masnitz and Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. He says, yes, it's true that this brisa is clear that you need dalet al dalet, but that's the brisa. Our Mishnah is not going like that. This brisa is going according to the Rabbanan. Our Mishnah is going to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Which Rabbanan, which Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov we're referring to? We're referring to the segment of the Mishnah that talks about pouring the water into a canal, pouring the water into a conduit that runs from the chalzer into the Rishus HaRabim. Now over there, we said, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov said, you can pour the water into this conduit. You can pour the water directly into the conduit and have it drain out to the Rishus HaRabim, as long as it's covered in 4 amas. The first 4 amas of it is covered. So why is that so? Because if you now pour it into the conduit, so l'chayra, the way Rabbi Zera is learning, you're pouring into the conduit. There's 4 amas of area there. So therefore, there's enough area for the water to get absorbed. So your desire is not to have it flow onto the Rishus HaRabim because there's enough area in the covered part of the conduit to have it absorbed in its place. What if it does flow into the Rishus HaRabim? It's not intentional. And it's indirect, so therefore be mut. So you see, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov learns, he holds that the issue, the criteria is absorption, because the conduit isn't dalet about dalet. The conduit, there's no need for zilu, for sprinkling it. It's a covered conduit. So therefore, the Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov learns that the criteria is absorption. And our Mishnah, the reish of our Mishnah is going from the Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. But the Chachamim say that no, that you can't pour it directly into the conduit. They say you have to pour it onto the roof or the chaser, and then it can flow on its own into the conduit. So why can't you pour it into the conduit? There's enough for absorption. Must be that the Chachamim are learning that the criteria is not absorption, the criteria is ziluf. And therefore you cannot pour it into the conduit. So the ratio of the Mishnah, our ratio that says that the chaser, which is less than arba, you need an uka, but if it's more, you don't. Our Rebbe learns our Mishnah, the Reisha of our Mishnah is going like Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. The Brisa is going according to the Chachamim, and that's why the Brisa says Dalet al Dalet. Well, what's forcing him to say that? Why don't you say our Mishnah is going according to the Chachamim, and it's consistent with the Brisa? Why do you have to say, what's forcing you to say that our Mishnah is like Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov? Amar Rava says, Masnis and Kashisa, because he had a difficulty with the Mishnah. My ear, the Tane, why the Mishnah says Chotzer Sheep Chusa, it says a Chotzer which is less, if it is the criteria Zilf. And if you need Dalet al Dalet, so why does the Reish of the Mishnah say a Chotzer which is less than Dalet? Listen, a Chotzer Shein Ba Dalet Amos or Dalet Amos. It should be precise and say a Chotzer that's not Dalet al Dalet, because the configuration is also part of the requirement. Elav Shema Mino must be Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. He Shema Mino must be that the Reish is Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, and it's not Dalet. The requirement is not Dalet al Dalet. The requirement is Dalet. It means 16 square amas, regardless of the configuration. So therefore, the Reish must be Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. That the criteria is absorption, not sprinkling, not ziluf. Freik the Gemara of Amud Yomi Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Reish love Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Well, the Seifa says Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. The Seifa, which talks about the conduit, which is covered, that mentions Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, which implies that the Reish is not Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. The Gemara says, no, Kulu Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. The entire section of the Mishnah is going according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, and it's missing, and this is how you have to learn it. Is if you have a chalzer which is less than Dalet Amos, you can't pour out the water onto it in Shabbos. Dalet Amos, but if it has Dalet, not Dalet al Dalet, but it has Dalet Shayfchen. Why is that? Shir, it's continuation. Shir Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, because he says Bib Kamer Dalet Amos Shus Rabim, a drainage conduit that is covered for the first 4 Amos in the Shus Rabim. Shayfel Seichem Shabbos. You're allowed to pour water into it in Shabbos. Therefore, you see, that's Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says that the criteria is absorption, not sprinkling. Therefore, if the chaser has Dalet, even if it doesn't have Dalet al Dalet, you can pour into it. So now discussing this din of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, Amar Biv HaKomer, he says that the drainage conduit which is covered, the Gemara says, Masnis and Deloy Kechananya. Our Mishnah is not like the sheet of the Chachamim, is not like Hananya, because the Chachamim in our Mishnah say you can't pour it directly into the conduit, you can't pour it directly into it, but you can pour it from a roof, and it flows into the conduit and flows out. You can pour into the chotzer, and it flows into the conduit and flows out. That's not like Hananya. The Tanya Hananya, he says, Afilu gag meya ama, even if a roof is 100 amas long. So if you pour onto it, it takes time until it will now flow into the conduit. Still, lo yishbayich, they can't pour onto the roof and have it flow into the conduit. Also, because the roof is constructed not to absorb, but have it to flow away. So now the way they made the roofs were that they had flat roofs with channels. The water you pour onto it, it would flow away. It would flow and drain off the roof. So Hananya holds, since it doesn't rest over there, it's from the moment that you pour it, it's flowing. Now, even though it takes time to flow into the conduit, but from the moment you pour it, it's flowing. So it is as if you would pour it directly into the conduit. Now, just like the Chum say, you cannot pour it directly into the conduit. Hananya says you can't even pour it on the roof. The Chum say no. Pouring it on the roof and have it flow into the conduit, even though it's not sitting over there, it's not resting, it's flowing, but since there's a distance and it takes time, it's not like pouring it directly, it's multiple. Hananya says it's also Tana, we learned in the Brisa, so the Brisa qualifies this din that we just discussed. Zok the Brisa of a man, Dvar Mamor Masechet. When do you require the uka, the cesspool? That is in the summertime. That's when you require it. But in the winter time, when it's rainy, then you can pour it out and repeat it again. So there's a difference of opinion how to understand this. The medvar mamur. What is it referring to? So my time. What's the chilek between the rainy season and the summer season? Amar Rav Adam writes, he says the reason that in the winter that you don't need an ukas, the way Rava learns it is, in the winter you don't need an uka at all. You don't need an uka at all because in the winter time it's rainy, the chutzner is muddy, it's all dirty. So therefore he has no need, no desire for the water to drain out because anyway the chutzner is all dirty. So therefore he wants it to be in its place, and there's no reason to answer it, to pour it out, because he might pour it directly into the Rishus Harabim. He doesn't care if it's in the Chatzar or not. So therefore, there's no requirement, Rava learns, there's no requirement for an Uka whatsoever. Omerle Abaya, what do you mean, V'ray Sheifchin? But in the case of the drainage conduit, in the case of the conduit, the Chachamim say, in such a case, you cannot pour it directly into the conduit. Now over there, the Adam writes a Shiabolo, over there, the person wants it to stay where it is, to absorb in its place. He has no need for it to run into the Rishus Harabim, because it can stay in the conduit. There's enough length of the conduit that have it absorbed in its place, and he is not particular about it having it flowing into the Rishus Harabim, and yet the Chum say you cannot pour it directly into the conduit, and it says you can't pour it directly into it. Amrle, Rava answers, there's a over there, and what should we be concerned about? And what should we be concerned about in the rainy season, that pouring it into the chatzar without an uka? What should be the concern? If you're going to say because he wants the water to flow out because it'll muddy the chatzar, ruin the chatzar. It's rainy season, it's already muddy and dirty, so he doesn't care. So there's no reason to answer it thinking that therefore he might pour it directly into the Rishus Harabim. But if it's a counter of Gzeira, what would be the Gzeira? That people in the Rishus Harabim might see that it's the pipe, the conduit is draining, and they might think that it's mutter. Well, they think that the person water is draining into the Rishus Harabim. They might think that it's mutter to pour water into the Rishus Harabim. You see this, the water is draining from this person's conduit, that people might think, therefore it's mutter to dispose of the water and pour it into the Rishus Harabim. So, if that's the case, no, there's no reason to be geyser for that either, because some zinayis mekalchanahim in the wintertime, it's common to have the conduits are draining all the time from the rains. And even when it's not raining, it's common that there's a flow of water from the conduits into the Rishus Harabim. So people won't necessarily think that this person poured it into and directly into the conduit and it should flow into the Rishus Harabim. People will think it's just the flow of water from the rains. So there's no reason to be geyser. Mashein can, if you're talking about the summertime, and the Chum say you can't pour directly into the conduit, because over there people will see that the water is draining to the Rishus Harabim. People will think that it's mutter to throw the water into the Rishus Harabim, and therefore we're geyser. But that's only in the summertime. But in the wintertime, there's no gzer. So the way Rava learns it is that the Bryce is saying that in the winter, there's no requirement for an uka whatsoever. Amar Rav Nachman says, no, that's not the pshat in the Bryce. He's not that in the wintertime, there's no requirement. He learns differently. Maisek Shamim, if it's the winter uka machsek sasayim, if it's an uka that holds a sasayim, nice and light sasayim, then you're allowed to pour 2 saw into it. Machsek saw, if it's only machsek a saw, nice and less saw, you're only allowed to pour in a saw. If it's machsek sasayim, you can put in more. You can put in sasayim. The way Taisus learns it, even more than a sasayim. You can put even a kur kurayim. I mean, once you have the machsek sasayim, which is the normal daily requirement, then you can pour into it. We don't restrict you. But if it's only a saw, then you're only allowed to pour in a saw. In the summertime, machsek sasayim, if the ukas machsek sasayim, nice sasayim. Saw, but if it's less than a sasayim, if it's only a saw, a nice lakol ikar. Since it doesn't contain the daily requirement, then you can't pour into it whatsoever. So, well, why not? Why shouldn't we allow you, if it's machzik a saw, why shouldn't we allow you a saw? He says, because since the normal use is a sosayim, we're afraid a person will dispose of what the normal disposal amount is, which is a sosayim. And we're afraid that he'll pour a sosayim into the uka, which is only machzik a saw, because that's what you normally dispose of. Therefore, they said that in the summertime, if it's not machzik sosayim, you can't do it whatsoever. Why don't you say the same thing in the wintertime, that maybe he will, if it's only machzik a saw, he'll pour in a sosayim? One says, no. What should we be concerned of over there? If you say about the kilkal v'chatzim, right, that you say that he might dispose of more, and because he's concerned, he doesn't want this excess water to be in his chotzer, so it shouldn't muddy it and ruin it. On the kalkal v'kaima, it's a rainy season, it's only muddy anyway, it's ruined anyway. And if it's on account, you might say there's a gzera, because people will see that the water is draining and flowing into the Rishus Harabim, and they'll think that it's mutter to dispose of the water in the Rishus Harabim. It's all over that there's conduits that are draining water, and that comes from the rainwater, so they won't assume that it's mutter to dispose of the water in the Rishus Harabim. They'll assume that it's coming from the rainwater. So therefore, there's no reason to be geyser. But in the summertime, we're afraid that if it's machzik, only a saw, he'll dispose of the normal amount, which is a saim, and people think that it's mutter to pour into the Rishus Harabim, or he might intentionally want to keep his chotzer clean and dispose of more than the uka can hold, and therefore it's also. Abai says, Hilka, kurayim. Well, if you say in the rainy season that there's really no problem, because the chos is muddy anyway, and people see that conduits are draining anyway, then it should be mutter afil kurayim. So there's a machlokes rishonim how to learn that. Do we say, Rashi says that therefore, if you have an uka, even a kurayim is mutter, if you have an uka that's machzik sosayim, or the way the Rosh is learning is, therefore he's saying there's no reason for an uka, meaning he holds like Rabbah, there's no reason for an uka in the wintertime, because as you yourself said, there's no reason to be geyser. The chotzer rather is muddy anyway, and conduits are draining anyway, so there's no reason to be geyser, you shouldn't even need an uka. Then the Sefer of the Mishnah said, continued and said, if you have two balconies or two upper stories that are opposite each other, mixals and also uka. Some of the residents made an uka, mixals and loy also uka, and some did not. As also kamutorium, the ones that made the uka are mutter, as shall also uka asurim. The ones that didn't are also. So the Gemara, even if they joined together and they made an eruv, it's still the ones who did not make the uka, they cannot pour their water into the chotzer, into the uka of the other party. Amar Abaye, so Abaye says, my time, what's the reason? Why should that be? Why are you saying that just because they weren't mishtatev in the uka, they cannot pour the water? If you're going to say that there's too much water, meaning that each family will have two saw. One made an uka, so it will only contain their wastewater. The other ones, it won't be able to contain their water. But no, Valtanya, we learn in the Braisa, achas li uka, whether it's an uka v'achli gistra, or whether it's a broken keli, or berecha, or a fish pond, v'areva, or a small boat. If you have any of those are there to collect the water, afal pishin ismalu mayim erev Shabbos, even though they're full from erev Shabbos, shef l'seicha mayim Shabbos, you can pour water in on Shabbos. Meaning, as long as you have an uka or something that can contain the water that has sasayim, so once it has that shiur, even if it happens to be full, and before Shabbos it's already full, you can still pour into it. the way the Magen Avraham explains is because since you're required to have that size of an uka that can contain the normal daily usage of waste, the person will know that you cannot pour directly into the Rishus HaRabim. So therefore, we don't have to be geyser. So therefore, over here, well, even though you have two different families over here, and you have the two different areas, but so what? As long as there's one uka, and the uka is machzik sasayim, then it should be mutter even for the other residents to use it as well. So Eli Yitmar Hachi. So if you're going to say rather Hachi Yitmar, this is what was said. Amar Rav Lo Yishano Ele Shaloyer. That's only if they did not make an eruv. Aval Irvu Mutarin. That's only when they did not make an eruv. But in Chanami, if they did make an eruv, so therefore it's mutter for each family to carry the bucket down to the chatzar and pour it on, then it's mutter. Even if they didn't contribute to the uka, even if they didn't make it, but as long as there's an uka that's machzik zasayim, therefore you can pour water into the chatzar. They don't have to be partners in it, and it doesn't have to be twice the size to accommodate them. As long as you have the sasayim, then it's mutter. So that's only law. Well, eruv is mutar, but if they made an eruv, then it's mutar. If they didn't make an eruv, what's the reason that they're also? Because we're afraid if there's no eruv, they might take their kalim, their buckets from their house, and bring it down to the chatzar and pour it out and dispose of it. And if there's no eruv, it's also to carry from their house to the chatzar. So now the question arises, well, if there's no eruv, and you can't carry the bucket from the houses, even the ones that made the uka, even the residents that made the uka, it's still also for them to take a bucket into the chatzar. There's no eruv. So Tosfos explains as follows, that the ones that made the uka, presumably the uka is made that it's opposite their balcony, and it's in a way that it's usable, it's convenient to use it by pouring it directly down. So therefore, they can pour it down because it's a indirect pouring, and therefore they don't have to carry the bucket into the chatzar. Now, even though we are normally geyser even by indirect pouring, but not by a chatzar, Tosfos says. By a chatzar, we're not geyser. So the ones who made the uka, presumably the uka is located conveniently. They built it so it should be convenient for the usage, and it can be used without having to take the bucket down to the chatzar. They can pour it directly from their balcony. So we don't have to be geyser. The ones who were not mishtatev, so there the uka is not located close to them. So there, if there's no eruv, we're concerned they'll take the bucket, carry it down to the chatzar to pour it out, and it's also there's no eruv. Now let's say they were mishtatev. So why does that make it any better? There's no eruv. So the way Rashi explains it, if they were mishlata, presumably the uka was located in a way that is convenient for both parties, all parties who are mishlata, and therefore, again, they can pour it from the balcony without having to take the bucket down, and therefore we're not geyser. Kol gagas hayir rishus achas, or vavashle gag gavoyud, or nomoch yod divromer.